This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors, episode 22. My name's Andy, and as usual I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And I'm joined by Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
And I'm joined by our special guest today, Keith. Say hi, Keith.
Hello.
Hello. So we're continuing with a series which we're approximately calling Insider and Outsider, which is just our excuse to talk to people and hear their story. We think Keith has probably got some parts of life where he's an insider, parts of life where he's an outsider, or at least wouldn't that be true of anyone? So Keith, we're going to ask you just to tell us a bit of your story, and the way we thought we'd get going is just to ask you a little bit about what it was like growing up. What was it? How did your life sort of get going, and where's it gone from there? Is that too much?
How did it get going? I guess in a hospital somewhere that no longer exists, at the end of the Central Line in London, all the way east. And it just got going from there. I was born and raised in that bit of East London where some people consider it Essex, mostly because of the postcode and the history, and some people consider it East London, but no one really ever goes there for fun. I had I was brought up in a very strict Pentecostal family, and my parents migrated from Jamaica and settled here in the 60s, in their teens, and so they come under what I find cringy, this expression, Windrush generation, but they fit into that, and I had a very at times I'd say a very loving childhood with a lot of family, big family. Both of my parents are one of 8. On my dad's side, they were all in the UK. On my mum's side, all around the Americas and the UK. So I've got more than 50 cousins, like dotted around the place. So it was full of a lot of family, but also for me a lot of tension, a lot of anxiety growing up the way that I did. Gradually, as I got older, realizing that I was gay, and just that always being a source of conflict for me. And then I left left home. I went to university, studied Spanish, and just really got interested in learning about the rest of the world. And I think for me that was my escape. But I still have a lot of love for that specific bit of where I grew up. That again, a lot of people don't know. I think I've told one version of like multiple ways in which I could have approached that, but there's never one correct way.
So it seems like you sort of felt like an outsider but just from the place where you lived, in some sense, outside from something.
Yeah, the outsiderness comes from a lot. So even just the way that I described being born in Barking specifically, and moving around all different parts of northeast London, like we're outsiders in the fact that we didn't have this huge history of being brought up in Essex. Half the family were in different parts of East London. So there was that sense. There was also the outsiderness of being in a very, being in that Pentecostal family and having that like strong Caribbean traditions, and just it being one of the many scriptures that were kind of almost literally beaten into us was, you're in the world and not of the world. So I think I from day one I was going to be nothing but an outsider. And then of course not being not having the freedom to explore my sexuality as a teenager, even if I were heterosexual, like going on a date, like having a girlfriend would have been like out of the question. So not having that, so there was the outsiderness from friends and other people around me, or even the family that I had who didn't who weren't part of the church, and so like that insider outsider thing has always followed me around. But whereas before it was something that that I was taught was just part and parcel of me growing up, and I found difficult, and I'd constantly try and push against that. Now I find it quite joyous, and I try not to be smug about it. That's the only thing. Like there is a sense of sitting on top of, like, if I don't have to be inside, and that's what queerness is, isn't it? Like if you don't have to be normative, then suddenly that releases you from having to follow like a set structure. But that's also complicated, because then suddenly you're like, okay, maybe I have to create my own traditions. What's that going to look like? That takes a lot of work and effort, looking at relationships, how I've conducted it. Like suddenly I don't have that template of other people that I know, other people that I've grown up with, to follow.
So do you think that weirdly being brought up kind of with this mindset that you were an outsider actually then fitted you more for the life that you're living now, where you're reveling in and being an outsider? That's kind of interesting. Yeah,
100%. But I think there's a long space in between that.
Yeah.
That doesn't just click in. Yeah.
No. Yeah, sure, that's interesting.
I mean, can you say a bit more about the different layers of outsiderness? I mean, you and I have known each other for quite some time, and we should have said you're a writer, so you write quite a lot of interesting stuff. And one of the things that I remember from your writing is, I don't know if you want to retell it, but basically you had this moment where all of a sudden all those different worlds came together and you realized how far apart they were. And there's all these layers about being Pentecostal, being Caribbean, living in London, but not any part of London, your sexual identity. Like, can you say a little bit more about, I mean, it's not just one outsider layer, isn't it? It's like so many ones. And can you kind of parse that for us a little bit?
It's multiple. Like one thing that springs to mind, if we're just thinking about religion. So I grew up not just Pentecostal, but as we called it Jesus Name Pentecostal. So moving to university, one excuse for not going home on the weekend and going to church would be, I've got loads of work, so I'm going to go to another church. And so, I'd go to another church, which is fine to visit. But then always the question is, they're baptized in Jesus' name, and if they don't, they're not proper. Like, you can get away with going for a couple of weeks as a spectator, but there was no question of joining that. And
Because that tradition doesn't believe in the Trinity, right? So
Yeah.
they demand baptism in Jesus' name only, and they're really outside of everybody else, even within the small Pentecostal circuit. Yeah.
And so even within that, like there was always, I felt like an extra level of not being fully understood or being fully settled, except within like a very, very small group of people. And then, of course, being gay and that, and coming to terms with that, which took, that's a whole nother lot of unsettled. But then often I find in a lot of, queer LGBT like cultures, mainstream, it's kind of an atheism is kind of assumed. A bit like university, the same kind of, well, most university circles, studying Spanish, being in the humanities, it's just like, yeah, we're over this conversation. And so there are very few people, and I think probably consisting of about my brother and like and maybe like 3 other people who I feel like completely get it, and all the nuances as well. Like even with Jamaican heritage, I'm one of, my parents migrated. They had me when they were, at the time, my mum would have been considered older, having a child, and I'm the youngest by far. And so some of even the language that I grew up with is very different. I still do find it difficult sometimes hearing young people speak and hearing elements of Jamaican patois, which migrated to London back in the 50s and 60s, which then get twisted, which then get reinterpreted by media as well. And certain things take on a different nuance. I had an example of, one thing that really annoyed me, and this is different, but during the riots, the 2011 riots that happened, and the way that it was reported on the news, and then there were people, I remember seeing a news report, and they kind of translated someone's like BlackBerry message, and they said, it doesn't matter what ends you're from, let's go to, this place where they were gonna break in a shop, and they just translated ends as gang, which just literally means ends. What place are you from? That's not, that's not patois, but that was an example. Whereas, you have things like in Jamaican patois, you have pluralization will often be done via just adding dem. So instead of like a man, if you instead of saying men, you'd say mandem. And of course, like mandem is now something that young people and not so young people now say all the time, but has these kind of negative connotations. Even if you think about what happened with when that's why I mentioned the riots. Like what prompted the riots as well was when the police, under very, very strange circumstances, shot Mark Duggan. And they then, he was supposed to be part of a gang called Tottenham Mandem, apparently, which I don't know the ins and outs of Tottenham. Maybe it is a gang or not. But actually, anyone from Tottenham of a certain language is a Tottenham Mandem. Right? So, you've got these double layers. And so, anyway, I've gone into a language space for some reason.
That's all right.
But, there is something about feeling, for me, kind of inside and outside, a kind of a transition of even linguistic space.
Well, language is really important for feeling inside and outside of something, right? It's like,
well, I'm playing with that boundary as well, because it moves all the time.
You justify those that die by wearing the badge. They're the chosen ones. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge. They're the chosen ones. You justify those that died. They're the chosen ones.
I was just going to say it's fascinating because from a totally different context, that's a lot of my experience as well, growing up in a Christian church that considered everybody else wasn't really a proper Christian, and going off to university going, I think these people are kind of as good Christians as we are. I think that's fine. I just find it mind-blowing, our ability to box ourselves off and segregate ourselves without almost anyone asking us to, you know, that we...
Yeah. I think though it's comforting to create a rigid boundary and to say we are the chosen and other people aren't doing this correctly, so they're not, and they're outside. And it gives you a sense of certainty and confidence and justice, where when things don't go right for you, you can always like rely on that I'm doing things the correct way, and even if it's not recognized in this lifetime, then I will be proven right in the end. And so then it creates a lot of fury directed outwards, which I think comes from a sense of not being validated now. And I can't speak for everyone or like every circumstance, but that seems to be what I see in people that I know.
I think that fits in with the conversation we've been having, because we spent a lot of time talking about things like heaven and stuff, and in quite abstract ways, and then asking ourselves, why are we talking about like abstract theology when we're supposed to be talking about justice? But like you've just made the connection, we've been making the connection of what you believe about that kind of thing completely affects the way you behave right now, and actually also what you'll bring out, I think, is that the reason why you think that about the future is maybe because of what's happening to you now and how you're. So you described the situation you grew up in as strict. So could you tell us a bit more about what you mean by that?
Wow, where do I begin? Again, I feel like I'm not doing. I feel like I had it easy compared to like my older siblings. You know, like we weren't allowed to do things like go to the cinema, let alone like a pub. But parties, seeing friends socially who weren't from our church was frowned upon. You could do it in some circumstances, but it just really wasn't. And I think for girls and women it was a lot tougher because, you know, at the time growing up it changed. Women were not allowed to wear makeup or jewelry. Well, no one was allowed to wear makeup or jewelry, but you know, but women weren't allowed to, like, trousers were seen as men's apparel, so that meant, you know, that even things like schooling for, you know, girls from my church, like being bullied harshly for like turning up into school in like basically long dresses. But yeah, and of course there was always the fear of God coming back, you know, the second coming, and that was drummed in from a very early age, which is...
And that was fear, not like relief or whatever.
I think...
Well, you might be doing the wrong thing when it happens.
Well, yeah, so there were always these stories about, you know, someone who'd left church and then had an affair and then, like, had a heart attack while they were in bed with someone that they shouldn't be in. You know, there were all of these like stories, mostly coming from Birmingham, but like
that hotbed of immorality. Yeah.
It all happened.
In my head, like Birmingham is this place of like iniquity, like
Sodom.
But it's also where some of the best churches were. But I don't know. Like for me, like it was again because of the age gap and because of, you know, like having that drum top. We'd go to church. So church on a Sunday was an all day thing, more or less. Then we'd have like smaller group meetings on Wednesday. You'd have like young people's meetings like on the Friday, depending on the
to make sure you didn't go
church.
out somewhere else.
Yeah. So like there's different like, so it took up our whole life. So there was almost no opportunity to socialize. But then because of that being drummed in and because of seeing things like, there's this film from Ohio called A Thief in the Night, which is, it's worth, I think you can find it online now, which was all about, it was this, I can't remember the director, he had this kind of vision of what the second coming might be like, and it's this whole series. The Left Behind series basically was based on that, this 70s film, which we watched as a church several times, and I remember seeing bits of it. Anyway, I remember being 6 years old, and being terrified that I wasn't baptized yet, and I was like the youngest person in my church to get baptized because I begged. And I mean, I do have a long memory, which is another thing. But then I remember, so one incident that sticks out simply because I told it to someone else at a later date and they were shocked, like horrified. And I thought, but that was just normal. My mum she worked part-time, all the way in Stratford, and like, and she would drive to, you know, collect me at the end of the school day, and she must have got stuck in traffic or whatever. She was often a bit late, but I remember like holding hands with a teacher at the school. At the playground had emptied by this time. My mum was really late, and I just remember thinking, oh my God, like, you know, Jesus is coming back.
She's been taken and I've been left.
And not only that, like I knew that there was 7 years of tribulation to come, and there was this mark of the beast, and you can't buy or sell anything without the mark of the beast. And I'm like, I'm a kid. How am I going to survive for 7 years so that I can like make it to heaven? Like this is, and not only that, poor thing, my teacher, like I was crying by this time, and she was like, she must have just thought I was this really sensitive kid, and she was like, oh, don't worry, your mum hasn't forgotten you, she's not, you know, abandoned you. And I wasn't worried about that, and I couldn't tell her because I was like, you're evil. Yeah. And like you've been left behind as well, and I need to find somewhere that I can hide out for 7 years. And
no, we'll get the 666 tattoo.
And all because I hadn't got baptized. And I don't even think I told Mum that, but that is why. Yeah, I convinced them to get baptized. But it's so that you don't have to be, when you have that kind of fear, you don't really have to have any further strictness. like I already like was gonna toe the line a lot.
Self-policing, yeah.
So yeah, and I do wonder about that. A lot of the way that I was brought up is very much interconnected with the situation of my parents and their family and the church, it was quite new. It had split off from another church. So they were really passionate. Like, they'd set like fasts for like, a 40-day fast just out of the blue, or like a weekend fast. There'd be like, an order to like take time off work so that we could. It was really. I don't want to use the word fanatical because it's cheap, but it was. I'll use that as a placeholder. It was at the time, and after a few years, things settled, which is part of the reason why. Yeah, I feel like an almost outsiderness with that. Like, I've spoken with other people who were brought up in the same church that I went to, who were younger, like 6-7 years younger, and they've had none of the trauma that I've had. So yeah.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you. And now
Yes, because it's really interesting that the things that in an adult's life only last a couple of years can have this massive impact. Because my parents moved to the town that I grew up in because there were no proper Christians there, and they needed to start a proper church, right? So, whilst I don't remember having that real fear of the end times coming, I have to listen to a story like that and then reevaluate my own story and think, actually, mine was has similarities in terms of the level of, like, we're the only ones, and that's such a weird setup. And then to think about you in that situation where you're totally inside and no one else is, your very small group is inside, and then you start realizing that you're gay and deciding that or then feeling a sense, I think maybe, that you're unacceptable to that small group. Is that, I'm putting words in your mouth now. So what's it like to then think, well, there's only this tiny thing that I'm inside and I'm actually outside of that, or unacceptable to that?
It caused me just to section off bits of my life, which was difficult at the time. Understatement, but yeah, it was a very. I just remembered my teenage years being extremely unhappy, and yeah, like there's no getting away from that, and I'm angry about a lot of that still. But that anger has to go somewhere. And what I did find really helpful, useful, I don't know. I think just gradually opening up your world is invaluable. Like,
so what do you mean by that?
So being at university for the first time and joining the Christian Union, because it was like a must. It was like, you have to join the Christian Union even though they're not real Christians. You know, like,
right. It's better than the pub club. Yeah.
And then suddenly just seeing people who were really passionate and believers, and I couldn't really say that they were all going to hell, which is kind of the hard, judgmental stance that I had when I first entered the room. And I was like, they don't even clap properly, you know?
Always on the one.
Yeah, right? Like, what's that about? And then I think that I know the biggest life-changing event for me was going to the Dominican Republic. And I spent a year there because I was studying Spanish. And I was meant to go to Spain, but then I really didn't want to. So I found somewhere that I could go via church and via another church, and then like managed to find this organization which had like, they supported this school in the Dominican Republic, and the school was run by evangelicals, and it was like attached to like to an orphanage, which again we've had those conversations more recently about some of the damage that is done by orphanages, especially in cultures, a lot of Caribbean cultures, a lot of West African cultures in particular. I can't really speak for a lot of other places. You don't really get full orphans. You have people, there's always an uncle or a grand family. You always, and you always could live somewhere that is probably dodgy, as in the house will be overcrowded and there'll be, problems with, alcohol or whatever it is. But to then remove that child altogether out of a religious compulsion has its problems. That said, these were people from within the culture firmly, and they were just supported by an outside charity. And anyway, I spent this whole year, it felt like I'd completely escaped. I was still gay, but like I couldn't do anything about it. I was still like grappling with, what my religious beliefs meant or not. But I just spent that year feeling that I was serving somehow, and also just being embedded. This was before FaceTime and before when you still had to pay for Skype and all of that stuff. So I was in this very small town where hardly anyone spoke good English and hardly anyone spoke standard Spanish. It was like a really specific time and place. And I just lost myself there and met people who were such strong believers. And then I a couple of years ago, I had to write a show, a spoken word performance mixed show, but I used this scene. So I have to set this scene. I used it as the hinge point, the turning point for it. On my way back from the airport, after I'd landed, and I hadn't spoken to the people that I was meant to be staying with. One of them was the guy who'd set up the school with his wife. But I'd seen them on a video, and they had not seen me. They just knew an English person was coming for a year, and they were going to host me, and I was going to teach, and I was going to do stuff. And of course, what happened was they were expecting a 6-foot blonde guy. I'm the opposite of that, and I'd been given some like coins, pesos, and I had their numbers, but I realized that actually the 50 peso piece, like that was it. That wasn't really going to get me my phone call. So I was panicking, walking around this airport for, I don't know, maybe it feels like 2 hours. It probably was just about an hour. And then finally, there were these two men, and one of them who looked familiar from the video, but a bit older, was like, Keith? And I was like, yes, that's me. And then like you could see like he was relieved that he'd found me, and I was more than relieved. But anyway, I got in this car with these two strangers, both called Ramon, and the second but Ramon too, Ramon 1 is really, really lovely guy, and he spoke really slowly and clearly. I could understand him, but it was different. I'd learnt Spanish, and then suddenly there's these people like speaking, like instead of things like, hola, ¿cómo estás? You know, it's like, hola, ¿cómo está? ¿Cómo está todo? ¿Cómo has estado? ¿Cómo has-" It's like, it's really like S's are missing. And like, it's really like, it's just very different. And I was tired and jet lagged. Anyway, the other Ramon is from a region in the north where they talk like that. Like, if instead of saying ado, you'd say ow, and just everything is like, it's very difficult to pick up if you don't understand that way of speaking. And so he was just like saying things at me, and I didn't understand. And the other Ramon who was driving said, "Oh, don't worry, you can sleep." And I fell asleep, woke up, there was a gun in my face. we basically, so it was, because it was late in the evening, it had got, they were kind of worried because there'd been loads of roadblocks set up and stuff. And they'd wanted to get me out of the city and back into like this small town in the center of the island quickly. There's a lot of police checkpoints. There's a lot of, the roads were pretty bad. There was some like unrest. And so what had happened was we'd got to a checkpoint, and the military police, they'd obviously seen that there were suitcases in this Jeepetta, I want to call it, like a SUV. And so suddenly, like, I didn't realize what had happened, but then the one of the military had seen me like on the back of the thing and had pointed this, like, now I know like the context and it's much less alarming. It's a rusty old gun, but like he kind of pointed it into the window, and he was like trying to get us to get out the car so that he could search it, because we could be like tigres, we could be like delinquents. And but then Ramon, like tall Ramon, like then they said, "What have you got in the car?" And then Ramon had like said to the guy, even as he's trying to get me out, "Sir, we have one thing in the car." And he'd gone into his glove compartment, pulled out his Bible, and has said, "This is the only weapon that we have in this car." And you like, I could, yeah. Luckily, he spoke slow. I could basically the gist of it was, "This is the weapon that we have, and you need to like respect. You need to respect the weapon." And the guy said, some, like, I just heard pastor, you know, like something like, you know, just okay, go. All I know is we didn't have to get out of the car, and we passed on. And I just thought, wow, like, this is one. I could have been terrified, but I'd just been awoken, and to his confidence in his faith and absolute conviction, trying to preach to this guy, who probably just wanted a bit of a bribe and would have stolen my suitcase or something. That like absolute conviction was something that floored me. And I thought, the people that I grew up with, you know, the church that I grew up with, there was all of these talks about, you know, miracles and faith and but faced with a soldier with a gun saying get out the car, and then and preaching to this person, like how many of them would have done that? And the whole year I kind of watched him from afar, and the way that him and his wife in particular behaved and acted, and how they'd use their faith to change people's lives, even if I didn't agree with some of the methods, even if I don't necessarily now agree with orphanages, but even the way that they did that, they sort of decided they were going to recreate family structures and do house, and they prayed about everything, and they baptized in Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So as far as my parents, you know, as far as my parents were concerned, they weren't saved, right? And I'm like, and so when I went back home, when I went back to London, I went back to the church that I was supposedly, you know, this chosen space. I thought, actually, no, this ain't it. Like being kind of gatekeepery over who gets to be saved and what is the correct way to do things just is not where I want to be. But then, of course, once I took away that boundary, then I was like, oh, okay, then, well, I'm going to live my life. And actually, I've got my boyfriend here, and actually I've got... And thinking about, you know, Ramon and his wife, like they weren't, you know, gay affirming at all. And so there is still that conflict. But then I'm like, actually, what you've taught me is to go by your own convictions and your own passions. I'm not sure if, though, confronted with someone with a gun, I would get a Bible out.
That's really interesting, because I don't think...
Or your book of poetry.
Yeah.
I don't think I would have prescribed, like, for someone who's grown up in a sort of very tight thing. I'm not sure I would have thought that it would be healthy then for you to go to a place where people are kind of even more faithful in some sense. Although you're saying maybe it was a different type of faith, but... I would have thought you were going to describe, I went to a place where I could just forget all that stuff. But you're saying, in a way, you sort of went deeper, and that was a real important part of a real help to you, which is interesting.
Yeah.
What interests me in what you say is this kind of sense of where do we draw the boundaries? Like you're describing a setup which is not totally unfamiliar to me at all, where the boundaries are drawn really, really tight in, and it almost, I mean, with all respect to your family and other setups, I know it almost makes it sound laughable, doesn't it? Because it's so tight and so bizarre that this very small group of people should be the chosen lot. But then how many churches are drawing another space that's still setting the insider and the outsider, but it's just that much larger that it doesn't seem so ridiculous. Yeah. But there's still a fear that if you step outside, well, where are you? And there's still this sense that we must have a boundary somewhere. Yeah. That, like, if we don't draw it in here because that's silly, but we could draw it here. I'm using my hands, which is useless for a podcast, isn't it? Sorry, I'm showing a very small, tight space that we then, if we draw it a little bit wider, then there's still a boundary, isn't there? Because I still feel it's so prevalent in church that we feel the need to draw a boundary somewhere, I guess is what I'm saying. And that's a really hard thing to get past. And I don't know if there's a question there. Is there a question? What are your ideas about that kind of...
Yeah, I mean, maybe let me pick it up and ask, like, did you feel that larger Ramon, was doing that? Or was there another way of being a Christian that was more empowering? Because I mean, listening to you also about these tight boundaries and relating that to the experience of race in London or living in East London, you get a sense, this was a coping mechanism, right? You can still cast yourself as this chosen lot, even when the outside, but it's not open. It doesn't resolve anything. It doesn't talk about it. So you're drawing these boundaries to protect something when the larger problem is outside. And I get the sense from what you were talking about, Ramon, he was not doing that because he was more... he was interested in expanding his circle, maybe?
No, not even, because the church that he was part of... Well, yes and no. The church that he was part of was based on the brotherhood, the Plymouth Brethren,
Moravian,
And so, they had,
Plymouth, okay.
They have ideas over, again, saying women having their head covered and not being able to preach, which, funnily enough, out of all the restrictions that we had, women could give a word as long as they had their head. Like it's weird, like where the different boundaries lay. But what he did do was include in that school there were teachers who were Pentecostal, some who were from a different evangelical branch. As long as they weren't, Catholic or atheist, then it was fine. Which, but yeah, where to set those? Like, I wonder if the boundaries now are. But then that again feeds into a really Protestant narrative of religion being a personal thing, of saying, okay, well, these are my personal boundaries and I'm not going to judge. But even that has its own judgment, which is why I like to say that I feel settled in feeling unresolved.
Yeah.
What could we do if, how could we have not any boundaries? How would we? Is it possible?
That's a question, isn't it?
It's a question.
Yeah.
That's the question that Leah's question gives me, right? Like that description of we always seem to want to draw a line. What if we didn't? What would we actually be doing if we did that?
I think a lot of these boundaries come from a judgment. So you have to make a boundary and saying, okay, to be inside, you have to do this or you have to not do this. I think part of that removing the boundary or questioning the boundary is just questioning where that comes from and being honest about it. So, with women not wearing trousers, there's like one place in Leviticus, I think, I can't remember where it is now exactly in Leviticus. Everything unusual is in Leviticus anyway. But then there were things in there, we were taught that there's one song, every chapter in the book is mine, every page, every leaf, every line. And it's like, well, really?
Interesting. That's very individualistic. Like you mentioned, like the Protestant individualism, right? That's quite individualistic expression, isn't it?
But the mine is like every chapter, like every single word, every single dot in the Bible was designed for, and it's like, okay, so, I remember an argument that was had in the early days, which is when I just started learning Spanish. I was 13. And there was an argument over what Bible to use, and because we were brought up with the King James version, right? And it's like you can't be saved unless it's the King James. And I was like, okay, but what about if you don't speak English? And that wasn't really answered satisfactorily. But I was taught not to question too much. That was like I passed that. But some of those boundaries, I thought, came from a protection. If you have something rigid that is secure, then it protects you from the outside. And so, none of my uncles or aunts, to my knowledge, have ever been arrested. When my dad's the oldest, and so when he arrived in London, East Ham to be precise, in the mid-60s, it was tough. And then over the next decade, as his siblings were growing up, there were sus laws. So under the sus laws, the police could, and that's why stop and search, one of the reasons why stop and search is such a sore issue. There were so many abuses during that time, particularly in the 80s, so a bit later. But I mean, 70s, 80s, and even bits of the 60s were so tense. Just walking in the streets, just being outside, that actually having very strict parents, my grandparents, who taught them that unless you are on your way to church or to school, you are at home. They weren't allowed out in the street, and they had these rigid rules, and it's what saved them, and it's also what made them literate as they are, and as prone to rambling as I am.
That's really interesting. That reminded me of like the explanation I've heard of like why the Jewish laws say you shouldn't eat pork because it normally made you ill, right? It's in a way it's like a protective. It's like it feels very restrictive, but there's a protective purpose behind it, either conscious or unconscious.
Yeah.
Well, but it's also an unhealthy protection, isn't it? Because we then don't realize that these boundaries are there for a reason, because of our fear, perhaps, or because of the actual protection. Because then we could take them away, or then we could deal better with the people who cross boundaries and realize that there is a path out there. And I guess how do you feel all of this relates then to racial identity? I mean, on the one hand, like I said earlier, this is an understandable coping mechanism, but it just keeps alienating you toward the environment. It doesn't address the issue head on. I mean, you know, there's been a beautiful BBC documentary about a Caribbean church in Brixton, which sounds, you know, they're so liberation theology. I don't know if you've seen it, but it sounds like they're just picking up the community. They're speaking out against racial injustice. But what you experienced was quite the opposite. So how did those things relate? Was that a topic of racial oppression, or was it all sort of just like, we're not here for this anyway, it's about Jesus coming back, let's not talk about it?
The latter. There wasn't a let's not talk about it, but more of, you know, finish your studies and do what you need to do. Which, again, like for me, as, you know, the younger part of that of my family, I was then also taught, as long as you know, follow the rules and you can do what you want, you're not bound by the same rules. That's why I studied Spanish. What was that about? You know, like, I was seen as an oddity for doing that. But yeah, I think the conversations around racial justice are often not best, but like a good place to conduct that is through the prism of faith, because it can be more forgiving, and there's a lot of anger, and there are a lot of people who are traumatized generationally. You know, the people my dad's generation who were often terrorized on the streets, and I'm not putting that lightly, and it's not just a racial thing, it's also, I mean, look at what's happening now, where we're looking at abuse and murder and kidnap of women, you know, and the police have had, you know, a lot of responsibility when it comes to that. Again, my first partner was much older, and he had experienced a lot of harassment by police as well, simply standing outside a pub, and several times, like on different occasions, and was even like arrested for obstruction of a public highway for just standing outside a pub waiting for his partner at the time to. And I say all of that to say that sometimes we need to join up a lot of these different conversations, which is messy, and it will often lead us until we can acknowledge we're not going to go anywhere. So in terms of things like racial justice, I can see how, like, there's a direct lineage from the early 20th century revivals in California to the rebellions and a kind of Pan-African consciousness in the 1920s, which was an anti-colonial struggle, which then meant that Anglicanism was falling out of favour in places like Jamaica, where my parents are from, and Pentecostalism was.
You're going to have to.
Yeah.
You're going to have to unpack some of that for us less good historians. So go back to the 20th century revivals. Where are you talking about that?
So the advent of Pentecostalism is like more or less. I mean, Jörg will be much better and clearer and succinct on that.
But where is
that to you.
Where is that geographically? And you're then linking that to
Los Angeles black spirituality and the take up of that kind of spirituality all over the world. That's the link, right? Yeah. So in the sense that, and this is an argument that's been around in Pentecostal studies and has some truth, I think, is that, on the one hand, first of all, there was an authentic black spirituality that brought white people in its fold, and that was 50 years before the Civil Rights Movement, below the Mason-Dixie line, bringing black and white people together. So there was something there where there was a black agency right in the middle of Christianity that we think of white and Trumpist now, and that wasn't the beginning of that movement. And on the other hand, and correct me, Keith, if I'm wrong here, but I think also what you're pointing to is that the otherworldliness of that spirituality made some of those other conversations go away and gave them a different space in the sense that you just grouped together. It was about the Lord, it was about forgiveness, it was about letting the world be the world, and now we can just celebrate and be in this space together and wait for the Lord's coming.
I'd say yes in California and the southern US, yes in like post 60s UK, but what I feel is interesting is like this struggle with the end of empire as it was. I mean, it's not completely ended, but the end of empire, and you have struggles which have been going since rebellion after rebellion, which aren't talked about when we talk about transatlantic slavery, and when we talk about a largely black Jamaican population, I'm just using Jamaica, who had converted to Christianity a bit, but then this new like revolutionary expression of Christianity, Pentecostalism, which kind of maps for some people neatly onto other existing kind of West African traditions in particular, that then became adopted as a rebellion against the British, and I would say that's you can't really look at Pentecostalism in particular without connecting that dot, which is a big racialized dot, but then taking it back to then my experience later on, a century later, those conversations about racial justice are so embedded in it that it wasn't necessarily talked about, but it was that feeling of being against the establishment, being against Babylon, which again, Babylon, which is this, again from the 20s in Rastafari, and it's
Interesting.
I see like my upbringing as rebellion and rebelliousness, even in its we are really
even if it
strict.
didn't outright
Yeah.
rebel against
Yeah.
racial injustices in Britain, in its withdrawal, it was that. Wow, interesting.
Maybe it rebelled.
And of course, it's fair to say.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, just to add, like in America, it's also fair to say that this isn't the full story either, right? So there's a painful, long story of African American Pentecostalism that gets alienated by white Pentecostals very early on and reconciles only superficially in the 1990s. So just to close that loop up, but that's really, really interesting. That withdrawal is a way of rebelling. That's cool.
What were you going to say, Lou?
Sorry.
I was going to say kind of the same thing, that the rebellion took a form that it could in that context. So in the context of your parents' generation, possibly one of the only avenues for their rebellion was that kind of shut-offness and that forming of their own community.
That's my reading of it, though.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Some of those in workforces.
You said earlier, like, join up those conversations, and and what do you think that would look like if we did? What would it look like to join a oneness Pentecostal, not just with a Trinitarian Pentecostal, but with a SOAS Black Lives Matter activist? Like, is that? I find that really fascinating, but around what? Like, what could that look like?
I think some of the younger generation, that sounds... These young people. What I mean by that is there are a lot of people who were born and raised in this country, with parents born and raised in this country, who, whose kind of grandparents grew up in this narrow traditions that I did at the time, but they've kind of navigated their own ways around things, and maybe they're Pentecostal, maybe not, but it's not like they're living in a bubble anymore, and so I am, for instance, my mum every now and again will send me stuff. I mean, yeah, my mum sends me things on WhatsApp. She's engaged, and also she's, I know there were pastors who one pastor I can think of who wanted to run for mayor, not simply as a pastor on a kind of Christian ticket, but looking at social justice. And as much as I will strongly disagree still with a lot of Pentecostals in particular, because, the people closest to you have caused you the most pain, I think that there is so much people are complex and we operate within the system that we're given. So that joined up conversation might look like will probably be someone who is at SOAS and is like training to be a pastor and is doing, and they're all in one, because
well, it is about the compartmentalization. I often meet students who will tell you in the second year, that they know all of this from their own background. But of course they know they're not supposed to say this at university. So interesting. Thank you.
I think it's quite exciting to hear you say that it's possible that religion or Christianity might in some way be a way into like healing or helping with racial justice, because that's kind of the premise on which we started the podcast, but it also often seems completely pointless and stupid. So it's quite encouraging to hear you say that there's at least some possibility in your mind it might work. That wasn't a question. But that idea of forgiveness and like, it is true with all of the faults of Christians, and all the faults of that really highly individualistic ideology. I've met more Christians who've like confessed that they've done something wrong or forgiven someone who's done something wrong than people who weren't Christians. Maybe it's fueled by horrific guilt or condemnation. But it sometimes has that effect.
There's that, and there's also, forgiveness is a strange thing, and I'm sure you've probably. I didn't listen to the conversation if you've discussed that already.
No, we've done. We ought to do forgiveness. I'm not sure we have.
Oh, you should. I mean, there are some really interesting people who are like, there's the Forgiveness Project. There's like loads of things around that. And I think forgiveness is such a difficult act, because a bit like setting the boundaries, you have to second guess yourself. Why are you forgiven? Is it because you think that God's going to give you justice in the next life? Or is it because you know that letting go will help? Is it because you have this kind of righteous pity? Or are you like saying you're forgiven? But where there is forgiveness, I always cringe when like I hear, you hear it on the radio every now and again, someone's like child has been murdered and they'll be like, oh yeah, I forgive them. And I'm like, really? Like, and particularly when it comes to things like racial justice, it's so sorry, coming back to that joined up thing. Sometimes certain things happen and it's a symptom of a much wider thing. I remember just freaking out once where I was in I'll just name the place, Holland and Barrett. And I was in, and
they have this amazing discount. Right?
Yeah. So they had this discount on Manuka honey. At the time, there was this real craze on like Manuka honey, and a friend of mine like swore by it, and I had like some issue. I had what I realize now were parasites, was amoeba, and that's a whole other. So like I decided that I needed Manuka honey, and I was but they'd kind of sectioned it off behind like a glass thing that you could lift.
Especially for people with parasites. Is that what it was?
Right. Well, yeah. But I think it was to stop shoplifting and whatever. So there was no one around. There was someone at the checkout serving someone, and then there were two members of staff right at the back who were busy in conversation. I didn't want to interrupt them to like say, can you get this down? I just thought I'll lift it myself and get it out. Of course, this guy at the checkout sees me, shouts across to the two members of staff and says that he's seen me steal something and put it in my bag. I've got a carrier bag with like books in it, and this goes back to, needless to say, like I'm embarrassed because there's like loads of people in the shop. This is pre-pandemic, and loads of people in the shop, and I'm the only black person in there, and I'm being accused of shoplifting. And I think I taught earlier that day, I was doing my PhD, and I was like, do you know, I'm going to be Dr. Jarrett soon, but it just kind of it really just set off this. And he was just a kid. He was like, a kid behind the counter who may or may not have thought he saw something. I was doing something I wasn't supposed to do, but it's not illegal. And it really just set off all of the all of that rage and anger and resentment and everything, and all of the like times where because I used to do a lot of mentoring with young people in schools who'd be at risk of like being expelled. A lot of them were involved in gang violence, all of that. And I'm like, here I am, like almost Dr. Me, getting some like bougie manuka honey down from the shelf. And this kid behind the counter is saying that I've stolen something. And all of this has just come back. And it then reminded me of the time that I had a really traumatic stop and search incident. It brought that back so strongly. It was such a small thing, but I made a big thing of it at the time. By that, like, I mean, I just ended up just saying, I need to have a word with you and your manager. And like, and I talked at them for 10 minutes and I don't think any of it went in. They just knew that there was someone who was upset who shouldn't have. But also, it's a Friday. But all of that to say, like, these little things. So, you know, whether one person whose son is murdered decides to forgive or not, it will tap into hundreds of years of trauma and anger. And until we acknowledge those hundreds of years of trauma and anger, we're not going nowhere. And the worst thing about it is there are a lot of people who aren't as true. There are people who look exactly like me, perhaps, people who share the same skin tone as I do, who will have responded to that with a shrug of the shoulder and will not be. But at that moment,
on another day,
no, not on another day. At that time, I was like, it just fed into everything, and it feeds into. And so when we look at, you know, how African Americans are so protective over the culture, and you know, and even terms like woke, which have been misappropriated. You know, the reason why there's this protectionism is because of hundreds of years of unacknowledged pain. And even when it has been acknowledged, it's just scratching the surface. And that's history, which then determines, you know, how popular like one religious movement becomes, which then determines how likely someone is to want to take a COVID vaccine, to like all of these different things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I keep hoping that somewhere in the Bible there is something that speaks to that, and but let me finish. Obviously, there are plenty of things, but specifically, I'm trying to think about generations, and there's such a theme in the Bible about generations and generational sin, and also that the Bible is written to a communitarian culture, and we read it as individualists, and I haven't at all got my head around it, but I feel that there is something there that Jörg's probably about to tell me is easy to tap into, but I'm kind of I'm struggling to feel that there must be something that could speak more widely to our culture to say that thing that you feel is not your problem because you're a white person living today who hasn't done any of this stuff. Actually, it is part of your inherited sin, and how can we talk about that in a way that is useful and meaningful and restorative and confessional and repentative and all those kind of things. And I'm now waffling, so over to you, Jörg. But
no, I mean that totally connects with what I was thinking about, because I think we have it staring in our face. We talk about the story of Jesus and about repentance in that story. We talk about our shared sin and bringing him to the cross, but we have made it so metaphysical, so abstract, so just as a lawyering game that he can forgive you. If we were really to take this seriously, then I would look at my brother's pain and I would cry. I would realize this is me too. This is, I inherit this. This is what real repentance means, and we just want forgiveness without going through those steps. Like how Israel sits collectively in exile. As Christians, we want to wipe that all away, and we treat the death of Jesus as this sort of little metaphysical game that God's playing. I mean, that kind of comes back to what we were saying about the cross in one of the earlier episodes. If we had a real theology of the cross that would talk about collective guilt, and that would take the cross as that symbol of what we can do to one another every day, then it would really speak to us. But we can't, and this is why I think the whole thing about forgiving a murderer is so cheap when it feels like you're just glossing over it. There hasn't been true repentance. There hasn't been, obviously in this case not on the side of the people who are forgiving, but like on the side of the person who's done this. There hasn't been true recognition of the pain. There hasn't been. So our theology of the cross is wrong. I that's where I'd start anyway.
I should say I wouldn't want to criticise the person doing the forgiving in that specific scenario.
No.
Because it brings them something, could bring them freedom.
But it's kind of always the context that we talk about forgiveness in, and there is a much
and not
wider.
the little stuff.
I know we don't want to go into the whole royal family thing, but it just absolutely hit me.
How do you know that, Leah?
I know you don't want to.
Maybe we do.
Maybe we do. Okay, well, maybe we do. But it absolutely
who
hit
do you
me.
mean?
No, last week when old Prince William said, "We are very much not a racist family," I was like, "Oh!" Like your family and my family have also responsibility. Oversaw the most, one of the most racist empires that ever existed, and I have never heard the royal family ever kind of come near to repentance for that. So how can you claim your family is not racist when Queen Victoria is your great-grandma? It just shows how far we have to come in our understanding of this, that was an okay thing to say. And I didn't hear anyone pick up on that in the news, but maybe I missed it.
Because it's individualized, right? So if Prince William never says anything racist, he's not part of the problem. And in the same way, I'm not part of the problem. And nobody really is, unless you're beating up somebody. And then I'm done. Yeah,
we are very much not a racist country.
This links in with so many of the different things we've talked about in previous podcasts. But going back to that question of what would it look like if we had no dividing line or no outer line, maybe that would mean that confession and repentance, maybe we'd be more comfortable with collective and generationally collective confession and repentance and reconciliation, if we didn't have the dividing line of not just the dividing line of the individual, but also we're not really part of society. We're just this little bit of society. But if we understood we're part of that generational thing, then it might give us permission. So I remember us talking in one of our very early episodes, now I'm rambling, sorry, in one of our very early episodes about the Pope, I think it was the Pope, saying sorry on behalf of some part of the empire.
It was the Archbishop of Canterbury, wasn't it?
It was the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Amritsar.
Same thing.
Yeah,
whatever.
He was at Amritsar, I think. I think that might have been one.
And we were like, well, the Archbishop didn't do it, but it's better than nothing kind of thing. But maybe it gives us, if we remove those barriers, maybe we're more able to accept collective responsibility, or and also do collective repentance.
Well, I think Jörg's right. That I think if we have this view that I get personally forgiven, I repent, I get personally forgiven, I'm okay. That's what enables us to have these boundaries, because that puts me back inside. Because I might stuff up sometimes, but it's okay. I'm doing the repentance, forgiveness.
I have no part in those people's sin.
No,
That's
exactly.
their problem.
I'm in, and that keeps me in because I'm repentant and I've been forgiven, and there we go. It's done. It's transactional, isn't it?
Bring it back to your story, though, Keith. The obsession with individual things, behaviour that's condemned, can also completely distract us from our collective problems, right? Is that something that you experienced? Or did you move past that?
Yeah, I don't see him moving past anything. I see him more. Do you know what? Like philosophically, it sounds a bit airy fairy, but one of the most profound things at the time, I was like, wow. Someone said to me, she just like turned 53 or something, and she was like, someone said, I can't remember what she said, but then what someone had asked her, but then she said, well, I am 6 and I am 12 and I am a 20-year-old woman and I am all of these things at the same time. And so I don't think we should ever move past things. We have to absorb them.
Oh man, I've been doing it all wrong again.
So that's my own.
No, I think you've got. I think it's a really important point. So I continue.
No, that's it. Just that's my own take on it. So like I never that way. I'm never seeking closure, and I'm also aware, when it comes to things like racial justice, I don't consider history as history. It's something that we've absorbed, and it's in the same way that we've absorbed language, in the same way that I can pick up Chaucer and kind of understand most of it because it's the same language that has evolved. It's been absorbed, and so all we do is reshape it, and that is messy, but I think a big part of it comes just from acknowledging that we are at a certain place. I don't know.
But that can be painful, can it? I mean, like, especially then when it comes to like your sexual identity, for example, then are you saying there's never a way to get that alienating part out of you?
Definitely.
It's just something that just has to live there.
Yeah. And so then I can see that as a source of power. As I said, like queerness for me isn't just sexuality, it's an approach where I no longer have to follow what is deemed normative, but then that becomes difficult because then I have to make choices and be accountable for those choices. At the same time, it's freeing. I think that discomfort is freeing as well as being painful. I've had that, my mum, that guilt of my mum sending me to a Christian counselor to try and heal me, and me having to feel that I need to say, yep, I'm healed now, it's worked, because I know that she paid him money and she couldn't afford to send me back again. Like that, I will never, ever, ever let go of. But instead of having to move past it, it's something that I can hold, I hope.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I think that's profound, yeah.
I'm going to ask you one more question. I'm going to check with Jörg and Leah whether there's anything burning that they want to ask. I'm not kidding.
Oh, there's so much, but we've been chatting for so long.
Oh my God, yes.
So, it's been such a pleasure to meet you, Keith. I've got one more question, and then I'm going to ask you whether you would share a poem with us if I can spring that on you, or if not, that's fine. But no, you're nodding. Okay, thanks. But yeah, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to listening back to this podcast.
I'm not.
Well, you don't have to.
I'll skip. I'll listen to the next
one. So my question is, no, I can't phrase this wrong because you've just by the way, you're such a perfect guest for this podcast because what we constantly do is stop halfway through a sentence to contradict ourselves. And I noticed you doing that those times. So this is me stopping in the middle of my question to contradict myself. So I was going to say, where have you ended up? But that you've already told me that's the wrong question in what you just said. So what I want to ask you is, like, where are you now? What is happening in your thinking and in your life now? And in particular, like, with your relationship with, like, Christianity, sexuality and race. Tiny question.
That's like a massive question.
Half a minute, please. We need to wrap up. And then smooth into the poem if you could.
Actually, do you know what? I could do a poem which kind of sums up some of that.
Oh, wow.
Simply because I was thinking, and I was listening back on the podcast on one of your last ones where you were talking about kind of is God good, and and all of that, and some really deep questions when we're thinking about things like hell and whatever. And some of the Bible's really, really violent, and but there's a story that I love for the humor of it, and the violence and the awfulness of it. And that's where I'm at with, like, holding that and thinking, actually, this is wrong. But actually, this is such a brilliant story, and it feeds into my other anxieties, which are about, hair loss and my relationship with my mum, which is great most of the time, but has some of those unresolved things. Would I be happy with her listening back to this? Probably not. So so I'll leave this poem, which maybe it doesn't fit, I don't know. I just thought that question has, like, I could end up like going on like
I apologise.
No. So this is called Scalp. Receding since 24, I think of all the thin-skinned prophets with even thinner hair, how in other circumstances I might have been president. The midwife who delivered me, according to my mother, said I cried like a leader. Or maybe I would have inherited a double portion of the spirit. It's a myth that male pattern baldness runs in the mother's genes. Her father died with a full head of grey. I will die with my cap on. I don't recognize myself in the mirror without one, and apart from that one moment of lucidity in the yard, my grandfather didn't recognize me either. When teaching in schools, I get called far worse things than baldy. I wouldn't wish for my pupils' deaths, but in the Bible, 2 Kings 2 ends with 2 she-bears mauling the prophet Elisha's young tormentors. In the King James Version, they say, "Go up, thou bald head." It's funny as hell. Then it isn't. They're not even named. 42 kids killed at God's bidding. Since becoming a full-time faggot, I've been rethinking power imbalances, all the strands that tie structural oppressions together. When I was a child, handing my mother her rollers one by one at night, I didn't question God this way. And then one day I became too old to stand so close to her parted scalp. I still don't question my mother, or rarely. This, I would venture, does run in our genes. Her mother was twice as spirited. I peel my head every 4th day with a zero fade clipper. Less hair lands on the bathroom floor each time. A mixed blessing. Though I now seldom pray, I call her more, trying to let go.
Wow. We've done this podcast all wrong. We should have let you read poems all through.
Yeah, I think you're right. That was awesome.
I mean, your answers were awesome too. That was great.
Oh, Thank you so much, Keith. Let's do another 3 of these tomorrow night and then the next night. It's fantastic to meet you.
Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
The listener, we'll see you next time.
Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of. Kill it in the name of.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Now you do what they told you. And now you do what they told you.